Okay, so we are starting chapter 2 of part 3 of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. Right, we finished chapter 1 last time. So chapter 1 had to do with the sort of first stages of his philosophical anthropology, his genesis of different modes of existence of the human being. So we started with the magical mode of existence, which is structured by these key points. So the sort of network of key points in space and time. And then the magical mode of existence splits into figure and ground principles or separate modes of existence concerning figure and ground. So the figural mode of existence would be the technical. So this is characterized by its possibility of detachment from its surroundings. So it's not tied to these key points anymore. You can take a technical object and move it and use it anywhere with the same efficacy. And then the ground aspect is the religious mode of existence, which is characterized by this sort of universality. It's not tied to any location because it's a universal principle. And then, so we saw the sort of split in the magical mode of existence that creates these different subsequent modes of existence. And then now we're going to see, I believe, if I remember correctly, now we're going to see the ways in which those modes of existence are related to each other. So how the split is sort of repaired in a second instance, and those unifications, secondary unifications, are going to institute new modes of existence. So we'll see the aesthetic and the philosophical and so on. So that's where we're starting at today. So I will start reading. So chapter 2, relations between technical thought and other species of thought. Section 1, technical thought and aesthetic thought. According to a genetic hypothesis such as this one, it would be best not to consider the different modes of thought as parallel to one another. Thus, one cannot compare religious thought and magical thought because they are not on the same level. But on the contrary, it is possible to compare technical thought and religious thought because they are contemporary to one another. In order to compare them, it is not enough to determine their particular characteristics as if they were a species of a genus. One must return to the genetic realization of their formation, for they exist as a couple, resulting from the split in primitive complete thought, which was magical thought. As for the aesthetic thought, it is never characteristic of a limited field or of a determinate species, but only of a tendency. It is that which maintains the function of totality. In this sense, it can be compared to magical thought, provided, however, that one specifies that it does not contain, as magical thought does, the possibility of splitting into techniques and religion. Indeed, far from going in the direction of a split, aesthetic thought is what maintains the implicit memory of unity. From one of the phases of splitting, it calls upon the other complementary phase. It seeks totality in thought and aims at recomposing a unity through an analogical relation where the appearance of phases could create the mutual isolation of thought in relation to itself.
And this is interesting, that relation between magical thought and aesthetic thought that I was so curious about when in the beginning of this part. I think that this is interesting characterization as a kind of in on the grounds of like an epistemic limitation, like or some kind of reflexive epistemic limitation.
What do you mean by the last bit there, or reflexive epistemic limitation?
Well, the mutual relation. Well, let me see the exact word. The mutual isolation of thought in relation to itself. At the very end, this seems to be this is kind of what I mean or with those terms, I guess, or this is how I interpret that to be a certain sense in which thought, the relation of thought to itself, indicates something in which thought and itself being thought are isolated from one another. So there's some kind of lack of systematic functional relation I guess I don't know exactly what to make that. What are y'all's thoughts?
The way I understand that last phrase, so like from the last semicolon onwards, is that aesthetic thought sort of is a return to unity, where the appearance of these phases of the split from the magical unity would maybe would have a tendency to create a sort of isolation of different spheres of thought from each other. So if that tendency towards splitting was not compensated by this tendency towards unity, then you would have this mutual isolation of thought in relation to itself, or of different modes of thought in relation to each other. That's how I understand that last bit.
Well, I don't know how clarifying my remarks would be at this point. I think that there's some point in which there's some kind of internal division within thought or between two parts of thought, that differentiates magical and aesthetic thought. And insofar as aesthetic thought is merely analogically related and that can't split into religious and technical thought. Is that I don't know. I don't know if that was clarifying, but that was kind of where what my interpretation of that last bit was. So it was probably about the same.
I keep thinking back to this image he gave us earlier of this symbolon as the token. You see the technical mode of thought and the religious mode of thought. Each are each house of the total magical token, let's say. So they are broken pieces. And it seems to me what aesthetics does is it perhaps doesn't exactly put them together, but creates a new artificial token, coins a new coin, and it serves as a new unity or totality in the way magical universe used to.
Yeah, I think that's a good image to bring up, because he's always, or that's an image that sort of recurs constantly in his work of that symbolon. And yeah, so we have a breaking of unity, and then a restoration, a secondary restoration of unity, which is not identical to the original unity, because it's as 61 pointed out, it doesn't have that capacity for splitting into technics and religion again. So it comes after the split between technics and religion. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read.
I can read. Give me 1 second. Such a way of approaching aesthetic effort would undoubtedly be untenable if one thus wanted to characterize works of art such as they exist in their institutional state in a given civilization, and even more so if one wanted to define the essence of aestheticism. But in order for works of art to be possible, they must be made possible by a fundamental tendency in the human being, and by the ability to experience the aesthetic impression in certain real and vital circumstances. The artwork that is part of a civilization uses aesthetic feeling and satisfies, sometimes artificially and in an illusory manner, man's tendency to seek a complement with respect to a totality. When he exerts a certain type of thought, it would be insufficient to say that the work of art manifests the nostalgia for magical thought. The work of art, in fact, grants us the equivalent of magical thought, since it recovers on the basis of a given situation and according to an analogical, structural, and qualitative relation, a universalizing continuity with respect to other situations and to other possible realities. The work of art reestablishes a reticular universe, at least for perception. But the work of art doesn't really reconstruct the primitive magical universe. This aesthetic universe is partial, integrated, and contained in the real and actual universe that has emerged from the split. In fact, the work of art above all sustains and preserves the ability to experience aesthetic feeling, just as language sustains the ability to think, without nevertheless itself being identical to thought.
It's here he's contrasting, or he's sort of warning about an incorrect approach to the work of art, which would be to consider it only in relation to a certain civilization or a certain I guess cultural environment. So he wants to tie the work of art not to its civilizational background, but rather to these fundamental modes of existence. And so he says that, so it's not to say, of course, that there isn't a respect in which works of art are related to the civilizational background, but that capacity to appreciate a work of art within a given civilization is dependent on the more fundamental capacity for aesthetic experience. That's how I understand this this bit here in this this paragraph. And I guess another point would be the way that the work of art, as he says, it remakes a particular universe. So in the sense that the same way that in the magical universe you had this reticulation or this structuring of the universe into these key points in space and time, the same way you have in the work of art, you have these sort of this new type of key point in the work of art, which, you know, there's a singular work of art in a specific place in a gallery or wherever it is, rather than with the technical object that can be sort of transported and reproduced in any number of copies.
I think that there's a fairly broad granting of powers of aesthetic thinking in terms of at least the start of an argument for something like this, when he says that a universalizing continuity with respect to other situations and to other possible realities. I mean, that's a fairly broad and important kind of value, I guess. This type of universalizing continuity. It doesn't seem as though like this would be in comportment with like a subjective perspective on art, reducing it to kind of merely feeling, but rather that participation in aesthetic thinking does something which is something universal and something which kind of is embedding sort of us into other contexts in a very direct way. So, and it seems like a very, very, very strong realist account of aesthetic thought so far. But of course, there's still the reference to aesthetic feeling. So, but I don't think that we should take this as meaning that this power is just in terms of like a purely subjective perspectival feeling, right? That there is something which is kind of happening in the world with these aesthetic judgments, that they have like objective norms or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's definitely not going to be it's not going to be a sort of subjectivist approach to art, which would reduce it to, you know, feelings of aesthetic pleasure, for example. It's it's a much more it's going to be more complicated than just purely subjective. There's going to be like you pointed to, this objective aspect to the artwork, so it points, the artwork has this continuity, as he expresses it, this universalizing continuity. So it relates. The artworks are related to each other. They form a network in the same way that the key points in the magical universe form the network. So I guess we'll have to see as we read on what exactly that means. So in what way do artworks relate to each other and form a network?
I've been remembering this historical cultural connection between Simondon and another thinker. I think they were friends, phenomenologist Michel Dufresne, I think. So he has a book called The Phenomenology of Aesthetic Experience. And I read in the description that he distinguishes the aesthetic object from the work of art. And this is in the scope of a larger work on aesthetic experience. Maybe there is a dialogue there to explore. I don't know much about Dufresne.
Yeah, I also basically know nothing about him besides his name. Yeah, that'll be something worth looking into. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what exactly the basis is for the distinction between a work of art and an aesthetic object in general. It sounds like the work of art is a subcategory of the aesthetic object, but I'm not sure. And I think for Simondon in particular, the work of art is going to be distinguished from a more general aesthetic object in the sense that precisely that it has that objective aspect to itself. It's not a purely subjective, something that's just the object of an experience. It's something that is part of a world, a structured world. And Hera has posted in the chat the question, is that because aesthetic experience can also be natural and not from artifice? Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. Right, so you can have an aesthetic experience from a landscape or a mountain or a beautiful bird or whatever it is that is not a work of art. So that would be something that yeah, it's an aesthetic object, but it's not an artwork. Whereas the artwork is always the product of human activity. So yeah, that could be something part of what is underlying that distinction. I'm not sure. We'll have to, I think, find out as we read whether that fits the text. So if someone else would like to read the next paragraph, we can investigate that possibility.
I can go. Aesthetic feeling is not relative to an artificial work. It signals in the exercise of a mode of thinking that is subsequent to the split, a perfection of completion that makes the ensemble of acts of thought capable of surpassing the limits of its domain, so as to evoke the completion of thought in other domains. A technical work perfect enough to be equivalent to a religious act, a religious work perfect enough to have the organizational and operational force of a technical activity, give off a feeling of perfection. Imperfect thought stays within its domain. The perfection of thought allows the metabasis eis allo that gives the fulfillment of a particular act a universal significance, through which an equivalent of the magical totality, which had been abandoned at the origin, is recovered at the end of human effort. And the world itself must be present and authorize this achievement after a long detour. The artistic impression implies the feeling of the complete perfection of an act, a perfection that objectively gives the radiance and an authority through which it becomes a remarkable point of lived reality, and not of experienced reality. This act becomes an outstanding point of the network of human life integrated within the world. From this outstanding point, a higher kinship with others is created, reconstituting an analog of the magical network of the universe.
Yeah, it seems like there's definitely that connection of that difference between the work of the product of a piece of an individual piece of art versus the aesthetic experience, that differentiation.
Yeah, it definitely seems as if that insertion into the network or into this world is part of what makes up that distinction. So the work of art is something that, because of this perfection, this quality of perfection that it has, it sort of reaches beyond itself to other works of art that have that same quality of perfection. Whereas an aesthetic experience would be something that's sort of self-contained. You just have this aesthetic experience, but it doesn't reach beyond itself to another work of art or to another aesthetic experience. So I think that's sort of along the right track of what that distinction entails.
Isn't there some sort of old connection between architecture and a religious act in the form of prayer? In the history of medieval thought, something like that. If you are a great, let's say, a religious official who can get a great temple built, then it is equivalent to a prayer.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're thinking of, but there's like within medieval churches, there's often like a chapel dedicated to a certain prince or whoever that basically paid for that chapel to be built, and so the act of building that chapel serves as a religious act. So yeah, the construction of the chapel or the church or whatever it is serves as a production of a work of art or an aesthetic object, but it's also a religious act at the same time.
Excuse me. I think it's interesting that unity seems to be so related to magical thought, whereas totality seems to be a relation related to aesthetic thought. Have y'all been reading this distinction in as well?
I hadn't noticed a distinction there. I thought he was using unity and totality as fairly synonymous terms. But yeah, I'll have to keep an eye out for that. I hadn't noticed that.
Okay, it could be me reading my own philosophical interests into the questions, perhaps. And maybe there's an issue with translation in terms of unity and totality. I'm not sure if they would be. They would probably be two separate terms in the original, right?
Yeah, it would be basically the same in French, so it would just be unité and totalité.
Oh, okay.
But I guess maybe one sense we could make of that distinction would be that whereas the magical world, you have this sort of overarching unity of the magical world, so everything is part of this one magical universe, whereas the work of art forms a sort of individuated totality. So you have one work of art that is a totality, whether it's a painting is a totality, or I don't know, a symphony or a poem or whatever it is. Each of them forms a totality. It's a sort of closed world, but then it also points to other works of art. So yeah, that could be one, I guess, way of making that distinction between unity and totality. But we'll have to see if that fits with what he says. So we can go on to the next one. I can read the next paragraph. Where are we? Yes. The aesthetic character of an act or a thing is its function of totality, its existence, both objectivity and subjective, as an outstanding point. Any act, any thing, any moment has in itself the ability to become an outstanding point of a new reticulation of the universe. Every culture selects the acts and situations that are apt to become outstanding points, but culture is not what creates the aptitude of a situation to become an outstanding point. It only forms a barrage against certain types of situations, leaving narrow straits for aesthetic expression with respect to the spontaneity of the aesthetic impression. Culture intervenes as limit rather than as creator. So again, we have this distinction between the cultural sphere or the civilizational sphere, which selects certain situations or certain acts as particular points. And then prior to that is the aesthetic impression or the aesthetic experience, which is the sort of what is selected. So it's the basis on which those points are drawn, I guess you could say.
And this narrow straits he mentions, I guess it's a limiting background for invention to happen as well, in aesthetics, for example.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. This reminds me of something one of my music teachers when I was a kid used to always say, is that it's not that creativity or creation doesn't come from having all sorts of choices, but from having limitations. So you're limited to certain notes or certain colors for painting or certain forms and so on. Having those forms imposed on you or imposing them on yourself is how you generate a creative work of art. And so that seems to fit with what he's saying here, that the sort of cultural selection process, it imposes these restrictions on a prior aesthetic sensibility or a prior faculty of aesthetic experience. And then those limitations are what give rise to creativity and invention of a work of art.
I think it's interesting though that it seems that the role of culture is only, I guess this would be kind of like a certain kind of like aesthetic like time period or something, like a certain like culture of like artists in some period of time or something like that, because it would be like culturally limited. This would only be involved in like the selection of some kind of pre-established forms rather than the kind of broad sense of creation of the forms. So yeah, that does make sense in terms of like a perspective of creativity from limitation.
Yeah, I guess there would be sort of a two level account here. So on the first level, you have the forms or the structures of the artwork are sort of given by the culture or civilization of that time and place. So they're just treated as given at the first level, but then at the second level, you would have an evolution of those forms and structures themselves through time, which would also be a kind of creativity. But yeah, that would be a second order creativity beyond sort of an individual creating artist, but as a civilization or a culture evolves through time. But we'll see. I'm not sure if Simon really develops that side. I can't really remember.
Well, here he seems to want to relegate it to a kind of contingent aspect. Not entirely contingent, but one which only has a selecting role versus like a generational role, a genitive role. No, that's not the right word. a productive role. I don't know.
Or a generative, you could say. I think.
Generative. Yeah, that would make more sense.
Yeah. So there's a sort of two step process, or the process has two elements to it. So you have the generation of these aesthetic experiences, which is a sort of fundamental faculty of the human being. And then you have the selection out of that sort of totality of possible aesthetic experiences. You have a selection of certain ones as these remarkable points of the aesthetic universe.
And so the role of the artist would be this more kind of contingent selection process rather than the generation of the artistic or aesthetic forms themselves, I guess, right? Is that the main takeaway from?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, for the individual artists, those structures would be given by the civilization or the culture in which they are brought up and develop their artistic abilities. But then, yeah, so in order to look at the history or the development through time of those structures, you'd have to sort of zoom out from the individual artists and look at a longer scale and an evolution over centuries rather than the creation in an individual lifetime.
Well, should I read the next paragraph so we don't accidentally talk about this one tiny paragraph for another hour?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots in each of these paragraphs, so we can continue. But yeah, I think we can go on to the next one.
Okay. The destiny of aesthetic thought, or more precisely of the aesthetic inspiration of all thought tending towards its own completion, is to reconstitute, within each mode of thinking, a reticulation that coincides with the reticulation of other modes of thinking. The aesthetic tendency is the ecumenism of thought. In this sense, beyond even the maturity of each of the genera of thought, there occurs a final reticulation that once again brings the separate types of thought which emerged from the shattering of primitive magic closer together. The first stage of each type of thought's development is isolation, non-adherence to the world, abstraction. Then, through its very development, each type of thought, which initially rejected what is not itself and behaved as a species, after having affirmed itself according to the unconditional monism of principles, pluralizes itself and widens according to a principle of plurality. One could say that each thought tends to become reticular and once more to adhere to the world after having distanced itself from it. After having mobilized and detached the schematic figures of the magical world from the world, technics return to the world to ally itself with it through the coinciding cement and rock of the cable and the valley, the pylon and the hill. A new reticulation establishes itself, chosen by technics, privileging certain places of the world in the synergetic alliance of technical schemas and natural powers. This is where aesthetic feeling appears, in this agreement and this surpassing of techniques once more becoming concrete, integrated, and attached to the world through the most outstanding key points. The mediation between man and the world becomes itself a world, the structure of the world. In the same manner, religious mediation accepts concretizing itself, after a dogmatism that was detached from the concreteness of the universe and having mobilized every dogma to conquer every representative of humankind. In other words, religious mediation accepts attaching itself to each culture and to each human group according to relatively pluralistic modalities. Unity becomes the unity of a network rather than becoming a monist unity of a single principle and a single faith. The maturity of techniques and of religions tends towards reincorporation into the world, the geographical world for techniques, the human world for religions. I'm going to have to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what is going on in this paragraph. It's extremely complicated.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Maybe we can go through it sort of not sentence by sentence, but sort of in order as it goes through, because it is fairly long as well. So maybe the first step would be or the first point, is this idea that he introduced a couple paragraphs earlier of the idea of the perfection or completion as being characteristic of the aesthetic mode of thought, or and as he points out here, it's not just of the aesthetic considered as a sort of separate sphere, but anything that has that quality of perfection or completion has a sort of aesthetic value to it. So any religious act or technical act that has that quality of perfection, it thereby acquires that quality, acquires an aesthetic value as well. But that aesthetic value is characterized by that pointing towards other aesthetic works as well. So a work of art points to other works of art in the network of the art world, and so by having that that quality of perfection, it points to other perfected works, and so in that sense, it has this plurality built into it, which is sort of the next point. So he gives a sort of schematic evolution of a mode of thought, starting from this sort of abstract detachment from the world, and then the development through this pluralization. I guess insofar as that work or that mode of thought acquires that quality of perfection, it pluralizes itself by pointing beyond itself. So each of these modes of thought becomes aesthetic by achieving that perfection or completion. So maybe that's a good place to stop for now, and then we can go on to a little bit more later in the paragraph.
This is a sentence which I got to this phrase, and I just kind of, my brain stopped, and I was like, how does this how does this make sense? And this is just in the first part of the paragraph. The aesthetic tendency is the ecumenism of thought. I know I had to actually look up that word to make sure that it meant what I thought it meant, but I believe I'm not sure if I even got the account of the word that Simondon was using, or I'm not sure what he might have meant specifically, because it seems like a word related to ecumenical, which is like a kind of more so religious word. But the aesthetic tendency is being differentiated from religion here, and it's supposed to mediate techniques and religion in some regards. So how is the aesthetic tendency the ecumenism of thought? How does this work?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up, because it is sort of difficult or obscure, I think. Ecumenism, as he writes it, I think is I don't think that's the normal way of writing the word. Like you would write ecumenicism or the ecumenical. And so in the sphere of religion, ecumenicism or the ecumenical approach to religion has to do with relations between different faiths or between different sects of a religion. Like I know that the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church recognize each other's baptisms, for example, if I'm not mistaken. So that would be a sort of ecumenical understanding between two different churches. So what does that have to do with the aesthetic tendency as he describes it? I think, or my guess is that it's because the aesthetic tendency here would mean the tendency towards this perfection or completion of a work, whether it's a technical work or a religious work. And insofar as the work has that perfection, it points towards other works that have that same perfection. And so, by contrast to the an earlier stage of religion that would sort of have this sort of universalizing aspect to it, it would be a religious act that has its own perfection in itself, and then can be related to other religious acts, and it doesn't require a sort of universalism in the same way that the earlier form of religion does. I'm not sure how clear that was, if that makes sense.
I was kind of making some sense of it. Is the rift between a kind of foundationalism in religious tendency versus a the ecumenism? Is that the distinction because of the generalizability of the religious tradition or something?
Yeah, I think we can distinguish, or what he wants to distinguish here in the history of religion is one stage where the religion sort of has this universalizing tendency or necessity built into it, where it has to impose itself on everyone. And then a later stage where that religion is sort of has its own concreteness within itself. It no longer requires everyone to adhere to that religion, and so it acquires this ecumenical character in the sense that it allows for relationships with other religions or other sects of the religion without needing to sort of conquer others. I think that's the type of development that he's pointing to here, and so he thinks this development is characteristic of the aesthetic mode of thought, or the aesthetic tendency in religion. So insofar as religion tends towards, insofar as a religious act tends towards that perfection or completion, it doesn't have that same need to conquer or to impose itself on everyone. It becomes more self-contained, and that self-containedness is precisely what makes it possible for that religion to have relations with other religions on a mode of equality, or this ecumenical relationship with others.
It's still fascinating in the usage that he uses it here, though, because the ecumenism of thought. So he's kind of repurposing the ecumenical kind of generalizability to an epistemic grounds rather than just religious ones, or an epistemic context rather than just a religious one. So, but keeping in line though with that generalizability, which seems to be important in the ecumenical sense for religious thought, and also for in technical thought as well, right? The generalizability. Whereas in magical thought, it doesn't seem to me that this generalizability is manifest whatsoever, because there's just kind of a primitive unity, right? So maybe this is the kind of vein that he's working with.
Yeah, and I think that points to the next sort of bit of the paragraph where he does talk about technical objects. So he wants to, I think, he wants to point to the same type of evolution within techniques as in the religious sphere. So there would be an ecumenism of techniques as well. And so we have this evolution where the technical sphere separates itself from the world. It has a sort of abstract detachment from the world. But then in later modes of technical reality, when we have the technical network or the technical ensemble, you have a return to the worlds. So you have the cable that stretches across a valley, or you have the pylon that is anchored in the hill. So the technical reality is sort of anchored in the worlds at a higher level, whereas previously it was detached from the worlds. So in what sense is that same evolution, is that evolution of the technical reality a form of ecumenism? I'm not entirely sure. That's a little bit obscure to me.
Yeah, no, I definitely read this as he's tying in that the same thing he's trying to purpose ecumenism for, in aesthetic tendency, kind of serving from this religious standpoint. I think that this is the same coming from the technical standpoint motivation, or at least like it's the same general structure or something. I don't know. I don't want to accidentally use an important word that I shouldn't use, like structure, for instance. But no, I think that there's definitely something to that generalizability and kind of diverging from the foundational account. I think I guess that would be the most succinct way that I could sum up that.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were getting at when you talk about diverging from the foundational, but I think in each case you have a sort of return to the world, an abstraction or detachment from the world, and then a return to the world. So in the case of religion, it's a return to the social world, as he puts it at the end of this paragraph, or the human world, I think is the term he uses. And then in the case of technics, it's a return to the natural geographical world from which it was originally detached. So it's that sort of circular motion of separation from the world and then a return to the world. I think that's for him what is that second phase, the return to the world, that's characterized as an ecumenism. And so that's the aesthetic tendency, is that return to the world through a perfection of the individual work or a completion of the individual work, whether it's a technical work or a religious work.
And that makes sense with earlier when he ended that paragraph with the mutual isolation of thought with itself, that there should be that kind of circular motion of thought and itself at 2 points in a circle, so to speak. But then that movement, I don't know. That probably isn't. There's no real circle, though. I don't know. I can't really see the circle, but I can see a back and forth type motion. So if that's what you're getting at, I think that I agree. I agree in that regard.
Yeah, circle is probably not the right word. It's more of I guess, a spiral, because it's moving forward at the same time. So it's not just a return to the world. It's not a return to the primitive magical unity. It's a return to the worlds after the split between religion and technics. So it's a return to a world that already has the structure built into it, an integration into a structured world. So it's a sort of spiral, or maybe a sine wave or something like that, where you have separating from the world and then a return to the worlds after a structuring has happened to that world. Yeah, so maybe that's a better image than just a circle.
So we're concluded that this paragraph is a sine wave.
Yes, now we just have to figure out what the frequency of that sine wave is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is there and then there's the maturity part towards the end, if I guess we're towards that part there. I don't know how to express this in terms of phase shifts or whatever, but in terms of sine waves, the sine wave has like matured. It's kind of a strange way to go about it, but it does seem to be that like along a further point in the sine wave or something along that line. You could say that that would be the mature point in the sine wave or something.
Yeah, I think if we're looking at it as a sine wave, it's where the wave returns to the origin point, but further along. So it's at the origin, or sorry, it returns to the x-axis, but further along the x-axis. So you have you have an immature starting phase where you have this magical unity of the universe, and then you have a progression of detachment from that magical universe and detachment from the world, and then a return descent back down to the x-axis, but further along. So you have a new world that is now structured rather than being just an undifferentiated magical unity. So that's, I think, what he's characterizing as maturity of technics and religion. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph. I can read. To this day, it does not appear possible for the two reticulations, that of technics within the geographical world and that of religions in the human world, to analogically encounter each other in a real symbolic relation. And yet only in this way could the aesthetic impression state the rediscovery of the magical totality by indicating that the forces of thought have once again found one another. Aesthetic feeling, common to both religious thought and technical thought, is the only bridge that could allow for the linking of these two halves of thought that result from the abandonment of magical thought.
So this might be a not productive way to question to or course of investigation to pursue, but he uses there's aesthetic thought, aesthetic feeling, aesthetic reality, aesthetic activity. He's using aesthetic for a lot of these things, and I think I'm kind of conflating some of them in my mind. So where I'm thinking like aesthetic thought and aesthetic feeling, should I think of those as synonymous or generally similar? And then aesthetic reality and aesthetic activity seem to be rather distinct. But I'm not sure about those two. Aesthetic feeling, is that which is common to both religious thought and technical thought? Is that the aesthetic thought? I know that that's almost like a splitting hairs kind of question, but
No, I think that's a good question, because I'm not sure of the answer either. It does seem like he's using a lot of these terms more or less synonymously. So he's in this paragraph, we have the aesthetic impression and we have the aesthetic, aesthetic impression, aesthetic feeling, which seem to be synonymous to me as far as I can tell. And then, we had in previous paragraphs aesthetic thought and aesthetic activity, I think, as well. But he seems to be using all of these terms, I think, roughly synonymously. I'm not sure if there's a sort of clear differentiation of these different terms. As far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be.
I'm thinking maybe in his context, there are some expectations of scholastic precision.
Yeah, I mean, normally he's a fairly precise writer. He does, have his sort of technical terms that he uses with a certain meaning, and he sticks to that meaning. So it would be, you would expect that he would be precise with his use of these terms, but he does. I guess there's still some room in his writing for synonymity or for having multiple ways of expressing the same thing. So yeah, I guess I'd have to go through this again, what we've read so far, and see to what extent he does differentiate between these different terms. I think one point, putting that question aside for a minute, or leaving it in the background. One point in this paragraph that is interesting is that it seems that aesthetic thought for him is not successful, or it doesn't. So it should perform this reunification of the religious and the technical, but it's not. It doesn't succeed at doing that. So he says, to this day, it does not appear possible for the two articulations to analogically encounter each other in a real symbolic relation. So the technical and the religious sphere are not properly unified in the aesthetic sphere or mode of existence. And so we have to go on from the aesthetic to another higher form of unity, which will be philosophical thought, as we'll see in the next paragraph. So I think we can go on to the next one if someone would like to read.
I can go. Philosophical thought, in order to know how to deal with the contribution of techniques and religion at the level of the distinction between the theoretical and practical modalities, can thus ask itself how aesthetic activity deals with this contribution at the level prior to the distinction of these modalities. What is broken in the move from magic to techniques and religion is the first structure of the universe, in other words, the reticulation of key points, which is a direct mediation between man and the world. And aesthetic activity preserves precisely this structure of reticulation. It cannot really preserve it in the world, since it cannot substitute itself for techniques and religion, which would be to recreate magic. But it preserves it by constructing a world in which it can continue to exist, and which is at once technical and religious. It is technical because it is constructed rather than natural, and because it uses the power of applying technical objects to the natural world in order to make the world of art. It is religious in the sense that this world incorporates the forces, the qualities, the characteristics of ground that techniques leave out. Instead of objectivating them by enclosing them in the tool or instrument, as technical thought does when it works on the basis of dissociated figural structures, aesthetic thought limits itself to concretizing the ground qualities via technical structures, staying in the space between religious subjectivation and technical objectivation. It thus makes the aesthetic reality, which is a new mediation between man and the world, an intermediate world between man and the world.
So there's a direct line from magical thought, aesthetic thought and philosophical thought, and that they're both involved in this this reticulation of key points. But I think I'm pretty sure that everything is involved in that more so because that's the what would be the kind of trace left over from magical thought that is supposed to inform the rest of the different categories of thought here. So that alone doesn't really say much. I'm not sure if that is an independent line, but there's a kind of symmetry involved with aesthetic thought and magical thought that I think philosophical thought is supposed to capture as well.
Yeah, actually, I think I was wrong when saying that this paragraph was going to sort of delineate what philosophical thought does. So he just sort of alludes to philosophical thought in the first sentence, but then he doesn't really develop more than that in what follows. But yeah, there is this aesthetic thought or aesthetic activity is a sort of echo of the primitive magical unity and its structuring into these key points. But it doesn't just restore that structure. It which would just be a return to magic. It has to unify the technical and the religious in a new way.
And the subject-object divide, which was initiated by the split into religious and technical thought, plays a pretty significant role in his explanation in this paragraph too.
Right. So we have the religious side is the subject side, and then the technical side is the object side. But in aesthetic thought, it's neither subjective nor objective. It has to unify both together.
And ostensibly in philosophical thought as well, right?
Yes, I think we'll see that later on. But yes, the philosophical is supposed to unite those two sides as well.
Oh, and also the structural versus ground distinction, I think, was well, I was trying to map that as well to the religious subjectification and technical objectification. That the concretizing the ground qualities would be related to religious subjectivation, and the concretizing the technical structures would be related to the technical objectivation.
Yeah, I think the figure ground distinction maps onto the subject object, or sorry, object and subject distinction. So the figural is the technical reality, which is the object side, and then the ground is the religious, which is the subject side. So yeah, that's how they map onto each other.
Okay. That's a much more linear perspective than the diagram would indicate, I guess. That it seems that in this split, which is it seems to be into kind of these mutual parts that are incommensurate. It does seem that there is like that there is a kind of more fundamental kind of order, I guess, of figure over ground.
Yeah, so sorry, that's just at the first level. Yeah, so in the first split into of magic into technics and religion, the figure and grounds distinction coincides with the subject object distinction. But then we also have further splits into figure and ground later on, which we haven't seen yet, but we will see at some point.
Okay, so the figure and ground kind of extends past the subject-object division.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Should I go on to the next paragraph, I guess?
Sure, sounds good.
Aesthetic reality, in fact, cannot be said to be either properly object or properly subject. There is, of course, a relative objectivity to the elements of this reality, but aesthetic reality is not detached from man and from the world like a technical object. It is neither tool nor instrument. It can stay attached to the world, for instance, by being an intentional organization of a natural reality. It can also stay attached to man by becoming a modulation of the voice, a turn of phrase, a way of dressing. It does not have this necessarily detachable character of the instrument. It can remain integrated, and normally it does stay integrated within human reality or the world. A statue is not placed just anywhere. A tree is not planted just anywhere. There is a beauty of things and of beings, and a beauty in the ways of being, and aesthetic activity starts by experiencing it and by organizing it, by respecting it when it is naturally produced. Conversely, technical activity constructs separately, detaching its objects and applying them to the world in an abstract and violent way. Even when the aesthetic object is produced in a detached way, as a statue or a lyre, and that's lyre, Lyre, this object remains a key point of a part of the world and of human reality. The statue thus placed before a temple is what makes sense for a defined social group, and the mere fact that it is placed in other in other words, that it occupies a key point that it uses and reinforces but does not create, shows that it is not a detached object. One can say that a lyre is an aesthetic object insofar as it produces sounds, but the sounds of the lyre are aesthetic objects only to the extent that they concretize a certain mode of expression, of communication, that already exists in man. The lyre can be carried like a tool, but the sounds it produces and which constitute the true aesthetic reality are integrated into human reality and the reality of the world. The lyre can only be listened to in silence or with certain determinate sounds, like that of the wind of the sea, that of the wind or the sea, and not with the noise of the voice or the murmur of a crowd. The sound of the lyre must integrate itself into the world in the same way the statue becomes integrated. Conversely, the technical object, insofar as it is a tool, does not become integrated because it can act and function anywhere.
So he starts off. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It will be better if you perhaps unpack it a bit. It's fuzzy for me.
Sure. Yeah. So we can start just with. So he starts off the paragraph with what we were saying in the previous paragraph, that the aesthetic object is neither object nor subject, or aesthetic reality is neither object nor subject. So it's something that's beyond that split, or it comes after that split. It's a sort of reunification. But then he contrasts the detachment of the technical object from the world with the aesthetic object's rootedness in the world, or concreteness in the world. So an aesthetic object is only it has a proper place in the world. It's you don't just put a statue anywhere. You put it in front of a temple or in a city square or something like that, where it has the proper environment. And so the same thing also applies in with the lyre, with the music of the lyre. It has an environment, not in space, but in terms of like a sound environment. So you can only listen to the lyre properly with in silence, or he says with the sound of the wind or the sound of the sea. But you can't listen to the lyre properly if you're in a crowded marketplace or something like that, where you have tons of people talking. So each aesthetic object has its own proper place in its surroundings, where unlike the technical object, which is detached from its surroundings and can be used anywhere.
I wonder though, that last bit kind of throws me for a loop because on the one hand that seems intuitive, but on the other hand it does seem like that same criteria for is related to the ecumenical criteria, I guess, that he wants to posit as related to aesthetic thought. And I'm not sure how does the notion of interchangeability in technical thought relate to this kind of context dependence, I guess, or I don't know. I'm gonna have to figure out how this works through. I have to read it over again a couple times, maybe.
So I think, yeah, if I understand correctly, I think you're asking about what is the relation between the distinction he's pointing to here, on the where the technical object is independent from the world, and then the aesthetic object is rooted in the world. What is the relation between that distinction and then the development of ecumenism that he pointed to in a couple paragraphs ago? Is that more or less what you're asking?
Right, yeah. If it seems that if does this, I was thinking about the ecumenical aspect as being related to a certain kind of interchangeability, which it seems to be, is what he wants to differentiate the technical object as having uniquely because of its it can act and function anywhere. But it does seem that the aesthetic thought would be that which would become integrated and then nonetheless be interchangeable and act and function in different places. For instance, like to bring it to the example of the paragraph, you could take a lyre and put it in a electronic music song and mess it up a lot, and then is it really a lyre anymore? I mean, does it produce the sound that it did? I mean, it doesn't seem as though it's limited in this interchangeable way, that this acting and functioning anywhere. Like, in what sense? Maybe that's what I don't understand, is in what sense is a lyre um, specifically limited to one locality or one context?
Yeah, that's a good question. So maybe part of the answer would be, so he does admit that the artistic object has a relative objectivity, as he puts it. So it does have some detachment from the world, and some, I guess, portability. So a capacity to exist in different environments, but there's still a distinction between what you can call a proper place for the aesthetic object and an improper place. So the statue that's stuck in a basement somewhere, that's not the proper place for the statue. Whereas putting it in front of the temple or some other public place is the proper place for it. So I think that's the sense in which there's a sort of connection to the world, or connection to an environment. It's because there's, even though you can move it or introduce it into a different environment, it's not in its proper environment if you do that. But it could still have multiple places that would be proper places, in the same way that there's a multiple, it's not tied to one specific place, but maybe a selected handful of proper places.
And I'll probably clear it up in the next paragraph. That's what always happens anyway. Well, not always, but often.
Yeah, so often I think his thought develops sort of progressively as you read through. So something that might not be clear in one paragraph, you keep reading, and then the next paragraph makes it more clear. So I can go on and read the next paragraph, and then maybe it'll help clear up some of this paragraph. Okay. It is indeed this integration that defines the aesthetic object, and not imitation. A piece of music that imitates noise cannot become integrated into the world because it replaces certain elements of the universe, for instance, the noise of the sea, rather than completing them. A statue, in a certain sense, imitates a man and replaces him, but this is not why it is an aesthetic work. It is an aesthetic work because it becomes integrated into the architecture of a town, marks the highest point of a promontory, forms the end point of a wall, or sits atop a tower. Aesthetic perception senses a certain number of requirements. There are empty spaces that need filling, rocks that need to bear a tower. There are a certain number of outstanding places in the world, exceptional points that attract and stimulate aesthetic creation, as there are a certain number of particular radiant moments in human life that distinguish themselves from others, that call for a work of art. The work resulting from this requirement of creation, from this sensitivity to places and moments of exception, does not copy the world or man, but rather extends them and becomes integrated with them. Even if it is detached, the artistic work does not arise from a rupture in the universe or in the lifetime of man. It comes as a surplus of already given reality, bringing it constructed structures, but constructed on foundations that are part of the real, and which become integrated into the world. The aesthetic work thus makes the universe bud, extending it by establishing a network of works. In other words, by establishing radiating realities of exception, key points of a universe that is at once human and natural. More detached from the world and from man than the magical universe's old network of key points, the spatial and temporal network of artworks is a mediation between man and the world, which preserves the structure of the magical world.
I love that the aesthetic work thus makes the universe bud.
Yeah, that's a good line. It's a very nice image of what he's talking about. So I think this paragraph is sort of develops what I was trying to point to when we were discussing the last paragraph, this idea of a proper place for something. So aesthetic thought is capable of recognizing something missing in the world. So you need a statue to fill up this space, or to make this square have a sort of proper structure and unification. Yeah, there's a sort of division of the world into places that require an artwork, or that call for an artwork, and then just sort of regular places that don't have that same relation to an artwork.
So it seems like this is generalizing the concept of site specificity to extend all over all aesthetics.
Right. Would I give a historical account of aesthetics then? Is that what distinguishes it? That it's kind of aesthetic historical?
I'm not sure what role exactly the historical plays here, because so he does point to it's an individual culture that is capable of recognizing the need for an artwork in a certain place, or a certain time. So those cultures would be historically determined, but I'm not sure if the historical is sort of a necessary characteristic of the aesthetic reality for him.
Maybe something kind of pseudo-historical or prehistorical, not prehistorical, but something in a very narrow sense historical in that it gives an account of aesthetics embedded in the world and in some place in some time. So in that sense, that's the only sense I really indicate historical. There, of course, historical in a more broad sense possibly could be outside that domain.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand what you mean then. Yeah, so in that sense, it's historical because it is, so the work of art is always embedded into an environment, which is a concrete place and time. And so, yeah, in that sense, it's historical. But maybe in another sense, yeah, in another sense, I think it would be sort of extra historical because it points to other artworks in that network of key points, or a network of works of art. So it's rooted in a historical and geographical surrounding, but it points beyond that surrounding as well. And so, like in the last sentence of this paragraph, he says that the temporal network, the spatial and temporal network of artworks, is more detached from the world and from man than the magical universe's old network of key points. So it's anchored in the concrete environment, but it's not limited to that environment. It has a sort of relative, as you said earlier, a relative objectivity, or a relative capacity for detachment from the world.
Yeah, the kind of detachment that can still be structure preserving somehow. Right.
Yeah, so it's a detachment that still preserves that structure of a world into points that are appropriate for an artwork and points that are not appropriate for an artwork. So it's you can move an artwork from an appropriate point to an inappropriate point, but then that structure is still preserved. And then this also applies not just to a spatial structure, a spatial environment, but also to temporal structure. So he points to key points in the lifetime of man. You can think of how different ceremonies are accompanied by music, for example, as an instance where you have a temporal environment in which a work of art is appropriate, or which calls for a work of art. So there's a temporal structure as well as a spatial structure. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next couple paragraphs, the short ones, so I'll read them together. It would undoubtedly be possible to affirm that there is a continuous transition between the technical and the aesthetic object, since there are technical objects that have an aesthetic value and that can be said to be beautiful. The aesthetic object can then be conceived as not being integrated into a universe, and thus, like the technical object, can be considered as detached, since a technical object can be considered as an aesthetic object. In fact, technical objects are not inherently beautiful in themselves, unless one is seeking a type of presentation that answers directly to aesthetic concerns. In this case, there is a true distance between the technical object and the aesthetic object. It is as if there were, in fact, two objects, the aesthetic object enveloping and masking the technical object. This is the case, for instance, when one sees a water tower built near a feudal ruin, camouflaged by added crenelles and painted the same color as the old stone. The technical object is contained in this fake tower, with its concrete tank, its pumps, its tubes. The hoax is silly and seen as such from the very first glance. The technical object retains its technicity beneath its aesthetic cover, hence the conflict that arises which gives the impression of the grotesque. Every disguise of a technical object generally produces the uncomfortable impression of a fake, and appears like a materialized lie. But in certain cases, there is a beauty proper to technical objects. This beauty appears when these objects become integrated within a world, whether it be geographical or human. Aesthetic feeling is then relative to this integration. It is like a gesture. The sails of a ship are not beautiful when they are at rest, but when the wind billows and inclines the entire mast, carrying the ship on the sea. It is the sail in the wind and on the sea that is beautiful, like the statue on the promontory. The lighthouse by the reef dominating the sea is beautiful, because it is integrated as a key point of the geographical and human world. A line of pylons supporting the cables that traverse the valley is beautiful, whereas the pylons, seen on the trucks that bring them, or the cables, on the big rolls that serve to transport them, are neutral. A tractor in a garage is merely a technical object. However, when it is at work, plowing, leaning into the furrow while the soil is turned over, it can be perceived as beautiful. Any technical object, mobile or fixed, can have its aesthetic epiphany, insofar as it extends the world and becomes integrated into it. But it is not only the technical object that is beautiful, it is the singular power of the world that the technical object concretizes. It is not only the line of pylons that is beautiful, it is the coupling of the lines, the rocks, and the valley. It is the tension and flexion of the cables. Herein resides a mute, silent, and ever-continued operation of technicity applying itself to the world.
This reminds me of when I would go on road trips when I was a kid across the U.S., and I would look out my window and see structures in the repetition, like light poles kind of passing by, and the sense that I got from that was a very, very compelling kind of image of like not just a technical object in its individual role, but the kind of like spacing and what more so what the spacing of them implied about their continuity with the world and my continuity with the world, I guess. So there was a kind of aesthetic value that I derived from the technical objects, so to speak, working in unity with the world, I guess, something like that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like the type of experience that he has in mind here. So it's not technical objects being sort of decorated that makes them beautiful, and he actually considers this a sort of almost a deception when you sort of dress up a technical object in a supposedly beautiful decoration or something like that. But it's insofar as the technical object is working in relation to a world. So the sails of the ship being billowing in the wind and carrying the ship is beautiful because it's the ship integrated and working in a world. So it's only insofar as a technical object is working and integrated into the world in its working that it is beautiful as a technical object, whereas just sort of dressing it up in decorations doesn't integrate it in the world in that same way.
I think that that my most recognizable aesthetic experiences of beauty have all been related to this specific relationship that Simondon is painting out between the work of technical objects in the world. Whereas I can appreciate in some sense it, like, is that like looking up into the stars or something like that. Those aren't the aesthetic experiences that really stand out for me, but rather this kind of like working in the world of technical objects seems to have a kind of primitive aesthetic power for me personally. I don't know how much of an aside that is or a tangent, but
no, that's interesting. That I mean, of course, there's going to be personal variation in terms of which types of aesthetic experience are have the most power for you, and that's it's interesting. So you're not like Kant, where you're filled with wonder by the starry sky above.
I don't know. I have just as much wonder about the non-starry sky as the starry sky. But maybe this is because of it being kind of like I don't know, that it's supposed to has a kind of false mystique that is related to cultural factors, I guess. It's like everybody has constantly been telling me, "Oh, look at the stars! Isn't this great?" And I'm just thinking, like, yeah, I guess this is great. And I mean, it doesn't fill me with an awe that's any greater than any other aesthetic experience, really.
Right, and that's maybe an interesting example too, because he in this text, Simondon is always relating aesthetic thought to aesthetic productions of things that are produced by human beings, whereas the starry sky, of course, is not produced by human beings. So it would be interesting to look at how that fits into his schema here, and are these sort of natural surroundings or natural environments, like when you have an aesthetic experience from a natural environment, is that something different than an aesthetic experience from a produced work of art? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm almost positive he's like about to go into this, right? Like this has happened like 3 times so far. It's like I'm really curious at this point, and then he addresses it in the next paragraph.
Yeah, that's quite possible. Maybe we should go on to the next one then, and we'll see.
Oh, I'll go, I guess. It's the technical object, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The technical object is not beautiful in every circumstance. It is beautiful when it encounters a singular and remarkable place in the world. The high voltage line is beautiful when it traverses a valley, the car when it turns, the train when it enters or exits a tunnel. The technical object is beautiful when it has encountered a ground that suits it, whose own figure it can be, in other words, whose own figure it can be. In other words, when it completes and expresses the world. The technical object can even be beautiful with respect to an object that is larger than itself, serving as its ground, in some ways as its universe. The radar antenna is beautiful when it is seen from the point of view of a ship, sitting atop the highest superstructure. Placed on the ground, it is nothing more than a rather crude cone mounted on a pivot. It was beautiful as the structural and functional completion of this whole ensemble, that is the ship, but it is not beautiful in itself and without reference to a universe. I guess that this paragraph kind of recapitulates what we were just talking about, so I'll just go on to the next one. This is
Sure.
why okay. This is why the discovery of the beauty of technical objects cannot be left to perception alone. The function of the object needs to be understood in thought. In other words, a technical education is needed if the beauty of technical objects is to appear as an integration of technical schemas into a universe, within the key points of this universe. How, for instance, could the beauty of a radio relay placed on a mountain and oriented towards another mountain where another relay is placed appear to the one who only sees a tower of mediocre height with a parabolic grid in which a very small dipole is placed? All of these figural structures need to be understood as emitting and receiving the bundle of directed waves that propagates from one tower to another through the clouds and the fog. It is with respect to this invisible, imperceptible, and real actual transmission that the whole ensemble formed by the mountains and the towers is beautiful, for the towers are placed at the key points of the two mountains in order to constitute the wireless cable. This type of beauty is as abstract as that of a geometric construction, and the function of the object needs to be understood in order for its structure and the relation of this structure with the world to be correctly imagined and aesthetically felt.
All right, so here we have the introduction of this idea of technical education as essential for the production of this type of aesthetic experience. So it's not just a sort of raw aesthetic experience from looking at a certain object. So like in the previous paragraph when he talked about how the radar or the radar antenna is, just treated by itself, it's just a sort of weird shaped cone thing that doesn't really have any aesthetic value. But then when it's integrated into the ship and it's working, then it becomes beautiful. So it's only someone who understands that working of the ship and of the radar antenna or of the radio towers on top of the two mountain peaks. It's only when you understand the functioning that you can have an aesthetic experience from those technical objects. So it sounds like there's a distinction between just sort of a work of art that would have a more sort of immediate appreciation, and then a technical object which can only be appreciated by someone who has that technical education and understands its mode of functioning.
I am trying to think about an exceptional case of a technical object that's beautiful. An object in disuse, for example. In that case, the activity Simondo seems to be gesturing toward is not there. It's not necessarily deploying its power to transmit something or conduct something, but it is fallen into disuse. I have in mind this example of parabolic sound dishes. I can give a link to it.
Yeah, that would be helpful if you can link to what it looks like. But what came to mind for me as you were talking about that is ancient ruins. Interesting. An acoustic mirror. But yeah, I was thinking of ancient ruins which have an aesthetic quality that's distinct from the same building that's preserved or that's been restored, for example. So there's a certain quality which this was like a sort of key figure for the Gothic movement or aesthetic. The idea of the ancient ruins, and you even had people that would build new ruins in their garden or whatever. So there's an aesthetic of ruins as such, which is not something that is active and working in the world in the same way that these technical objects that he's pointing to are. So I wonder if that's an exception to what he's developing here, or maybe that's a separate type of aesthetic experience. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think ruins would be the general category. There are even there's a category called ruin porn, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that there is like there's people that visit ghost towns, for example, to like there's a certain aesthetic quality of this empty town, and the sort of ruins of what was a town at one point. It has its own aesthetic quality as well. So there's something distinct from the technical object at work. There's a different type of aesthetic experience that you can get from this ruined technical object, or technical object that is in disrepair. So it'd be interesting to try to fit that into this schema and see how that works.
I guess that's the territory of the writer Ballard.
Right. Yeah, I'm only familiar with. I've only read a few of his stories, but yeah, I think that fits in with his work.
Wait, who did you mention? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
J.G. Ballard.
Oh, Ballard.
Yeah, a science fiction author, or yeah, I guess mostly science fiction. But yeah, I don't really know his work very well, but yeah, I guess some of these sort of ruined technical objects are sort of a theme or a motif found in his work.
Especially Terminal Beach.
Yeah, he's someone that I've had on my list that I needed to look into more. So yeah, I'll move him up on my list to see if I can get a hold of some of his books and read that in the near future.
Sounds interesting.
All right, so we found an exception that doesn't fit into what we've seen so far. We'll have to keep that in mind and see if he maybe does explain where that would fit into his conception of the aesthetic experience in a different way. We'll have to see what happens later on. So we can go on to the next paragraph, I think, unless there's other comments.
This paragraph looks like it's a full page, or
yeah, he loves these long paragraphs. Oh, actually, yeah, I didn't realize the time. Maybe we should stop here and leave that for the next session, because it's
okay
probably,
with that.
Yeah, it's probably going to take us past our 2 hours.
I think we've gotten more than enough to chew on so far with aesthetics. Aesthetics is always complicated, so I'm okay with stopping here and starting fresh next time with this paragraph.
Yeah, this is a long section, so oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm exhausted, I guess.
Sure. Okay, so we'll stop here. We'll pick up at page 198 next time. So I'll just shut off the recording